welcome to our morning edition of Arirang News. We begin with these stories making the headlines at this hour, starting with comments from the U.S. on relations with South Korea. The U.S. State Department says it's confident that the alliance between Seoul and Washington will continue to thrive under the new South Korean leadership. The comments come after President Lee held his first phone call with President Trump last week. The U.S. and China have agreed upon a trade framework after holding talks for 2 days in London. The two sides are now planning to report back to their leaders, with an American official saying this should resolve issues on rare earth export restrictions. BTS members Jimin and Jungkook have now been discharged from the South Korean military after their mandatory service. The 7-member boy band is expected to reunite soon, when Suga wraps up his duty as a social service agent later this month. The United States says it's confident that relations between Seoul and Washington will continue to thrive under the new South Korean President Lee Jae-myung, who took office last week. Now, that's according to Tammy Bruce, spokesperson for the State Department, during a press briefing on Tuesday local time. She said the U.S. congratulates Lee on his election, expressing optimism in response to a question about the new leader's approach to bilateral ties. Lee has said he will initiate pragmatic diplomacy and regards the Seoul-Washington alliance as the foundation of Korea's foreign policy. Following his first phone call with President Donald Trump last week, the two leaders are likely to hold a brief summit on the sidelines of the G7 meeting in Canada, starting on June 15th. And the U.S. and China have reached an agreement on a trade framework after their second high-level talks. If approved, this will allow them to implement terms agreed in the Geneva Consensus last month and could resolve Beijing's rare earth export restrictions on Washington. Our Eizyongs reports.
The United States and China have agreed on a trade framework that would allow them to implement an agreement reached at the trade talks held in Geneva last month. U.S. Commerce Secretary Harold Lutnick said Wednesday that the U.S. and China have reached a framework to implement the Geneva Consensus, which each negotiation team will present for approval by the leaders of both countries before it is put into effect. This comes after 2 full days of talks that began on Monday in London. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said Lutnick had already expressed optimism about the negotiations.
I have to go back to Washington to testify before Congress tomorrow. We have had 2 days of the productive talks.
No, I think we're working on all sorts of trade issues, and I think the talks are really, really well.
The high-level talks between the world's largest economies follow discussions held in Geneva on May 10th and 11th, where the U.S. and China agreed to temporarily slash tariffs. But since those talks, sentiment has soured with both sides accusing the other of breaching the agreement. As tensions escalated, U.S. President Donald Trump and Chinese leader Xi Jinping held a 90-minute phone call last week during which they agreed to move forward with a new round of trade talks. The U.S. announced strict export controls on advanced semiconductor chip technology and visa cancellations for Chinese students, while China had been slow to lift blocks on shipments of rare earth minerals, a key focus of this second round of talks. Lutnick expressed hope that the framework will help resolve China's rare earth export restrictions. Wall Street's 3 major indices closed higher on Tuesday, buoyed by optimism from senior U.S. administration officials. The blue-chip-focused Dow ended up 0.25%, the S&P 500 rose 0.55%, and the tech-heavy Nasdaq gained 0.63%. Eizyongs, Arirang News.
The World Bank has cut its global growth forecast for this year, citing the impact of escalating trade tensions. It now expects the global economy to grow just 2.3%, down 1.4 percentage points from its January forecasts. The bank said this would mark the slowest pace since the 2008 financial crisis, apart from outright global recessions. By country, the U.S. is projected to grow 1.4% this year, nearly 1 point lower than earlier forecasts and half the pace of last year's 2.8%. China's outlook holds steady at 4.5%, while the Eurozone forecast was trimmed to 0.7%, down 0.3 points. With the Los Angeles protests in their fifth day, demonstrations against Trump's immigration policy are spreading to other states. Hundreds of Marines arrived in LA to quell the unrest, while the California governor asks a court to block the Trump administration from using troops in immigration raids. Eizyongs has more.
The LA protests against U.S. President Donald Trump's immigration policies continued for the fifth day on Tuesday. According to the police, rioting, arson, and violence have somewhat subsided. However, the demonstrations against the crackdown and deportation of illegal immigrants are spreading to other major cities, including San Francisco, New York, and Chicago. With concerns lingering over the current state of the Los Angeles area, hundreds of U.S. Marines arrived on Tuesday under orders from President Trump. Around 700 Marines were seen awaiting deployment to specific locations. However, they do not have the authority to arrest anyone. Instead, the troops are set to be deployed to protect federal property and personnel. California Governor Gavin Newsom filed an emergency request at a federal court on Tuesday to stop the Trump administration from using both the National Guard and the Marines. Along with the recent deployment of Marines, some 4,000 National Guard members have been sent to LA to control the protests. Trump has also threatened to invoke the Insurrection Act, which would allow him to deploy the military and to federalize the National Guard units of the individual states if he determines the LA street protests to be an insurrection.
If there's an insurrection, I would certainly invoke it. We'll see, but I can tell you last night was terrible. The night before that was terrible. We have, as you've seen, it was on most of your networks, people with big, heavy hammers pounding the concrete and pounding curbs, pounding it, breaking up, and handing these big chunks of concrete to people.
Trump added that the National Guard will leave once it's deemed that the Los Angeles area is no longer considered dangerous. Meanwhile, progressive groups say that they'll be holding more than 1,500 No Kings protests across the country on Saturday, which is the same day a military parade is set to take place in the U.S. Capitol, marking the U.S. Army's 250th birthday. The organizers believe that Trump is using the military's birthday to celebrate his own birthday, which is also on June 14th. Eizyongs, Arirang News.
A week has passed since President Lee Jae-myung was sworn into office last Wednesday. For more on the key takeaways from Lee's first week in office, we're joined by Professor Lee Hyun, Professor of Law at Handong International Law School. Professor Lee, thanks for joining us this morning.
Thanks for having me on the program.
So it's been a full week since President Lee took office. What's your overall assessment so far, and what would you say is the most notable difference compared to the former Yoon administration?
Well, I mean, we're sort of at a honeymoon period for the Lee administration. So, as we go through the initial weeks of his presidency, what we're seeing is some of him laying out sort of his agenda, but also, as you noted, the stark contrast with the President Yoon administration. So, I mean, what we see most notably is obviously he has, and his party has legislative control, so he can easily pass through legislation. And we saw this just recently, yesterday, with the Special Counsel Act in terms of the bills that were passed to investigate the martial law, as well as the former First Lady. So I think that's obviously a big contrast from the previous administration, which was often deadlocked and often President Yoon vetoed the National Assembly. But also what we're looking at too is the focus on the domestic agenda, and particularly, as he's indicated with his appointments, really a desire to sort of spur the economy with more government spending. And so the fact that we haven't seen a person being nominated for the Ministry of Finance, I think lends to this idea that the presidential office is going to take more control in the reins when it comes to economic policy, and particularly, again, maybe through some stimulus to the economy in terms of more spending in the economy, in terms of spurring the activities there. But also, what we're seeing too is, he's making a lot of statements contrasting himself with President Yoon in terms of how to approach North Korea. And so, as opposed to more confrontation, there's a real signal here that there's going to be more engagement. And lastly, in terms of the judicial branch too, I think we're seeing a lot of talk, at least in terms of maybe some reforms there. And there have been talk about, the Supreme Court as well as other institutions, judicial institutions, which the Lee administration seems to be, I think, targeting with respect to making changes. So I think we've seen in this initial week, anyway, a lot of signals to really a lot of changes that are going to happen in the next 5 years.
Right, indeed. And the presidential office says it will accept recommendations from the public before appointing key government officials, including those at the ministerial level. So do you think this could help reduce controversy surrounding the appointment process?
Well, I think it's certainly it's a PR move by the administration, because this is basically not something that's unheard of, right? Because in the past, there was really no public input when it comes to the appointment of these high-level officials, like the minister-level officials in the government. So I think the idea here is it's supposed to be more transparent, more public accountability, and there will be more input, direct input from the people with respect to these high-level officials. But I think one of the difficulties here is when you have such a process, as opposed to appointing people based on merit, in terms of their sort of background and their expertise in being able to sort of handle these different ministerial jobs, that maybe this becomes more like a popularity contest. And in fact, let's say the people want a certain person, but another person has been selected, and there's going to be a lot of questions then as to whether or not the appointment was and having such a process by having such public input, where if you don't select the person that the people have sort of chosen, so to speak, then there's going to be lots of issues about, what's the purpose of this process if the public really doesn't have a real say. And this is just window dressing sort of on terms of dealing with this kind of issue. So I think, there's a lot of questions here as to whether or not this is a real sort of proposal as opposed to just being a PR stunt by the administration. So it remains to be seen as to whether or not the public will really have an input, and whether or not this is actually you're going to select the right people for the job when it comes to these kinds of important roles.
Right, and like you said, a lot of changes to the judicial branch, and plans to dramatically expand the Supreme Court have sparked controversy here in Seoul. What's your take on increasing the number of justices?
Yeah. I mean, this is a conversation that was being had even before, President Lee took office, particularly in terms of the cases that were being brought against President Lee, current President Lee now, of course, who was then running as a candidate for the office. And as we know, he was facing a number of criminal trials, and the Supreme Court basically, affirmed one of the overturned a high court decision that sort of denied guilt, but sort of reinstated essentially sort of a guilty sort of verdict, which was never confirmed at this point. But anyway, the Supreme Court was involved in that, and as a result, the reaction, I think, with respect to sort of the idea of court packing or significantly increasing the number of justices on the Supreme Court, I think runs the risk of really politicizing the courts and the judicial branch. And the difficulty with that, of course, is that the judicial branch shouldn't be political. It should be absolved from any political sort of influences and appearances of political bias. And so I think this potentially presents a real kind of problem, because the more justices that you have on the court, and the idea is that that's a direct reflection of the political sort of reality of what's going on in politics in Korea today, whereas the court itself should not be a political body, but should be a legal one and should be objective and not swayed by political views or biases. And so I think that the danger here potentially is with adding significantly more justices, you're going to potentially then politicize the whole judicial branch. And I think this becomes problematic, because then the trust in the judicial branch will become much less, because they view it more like a political institution as opposed to a legal one. So I think it remains to be seen as to the reality of whether or not this will actually go forward. But in any event, I think this will be one of the big issues early on in this administration as to whether or not this will actually go forward in the future.
Right, and like you mentioned, President Lee is also facing several trials, but 2 have been postponed indefinitely, with the court citing Article 84 of the Constitution. Could you briefly explain what Article 84 exactly is and share your legal analysis on this issue?
Right. So Article 84 of the Constitution basically gives the president, the sitting president, immunity from any criminal prosecution while he's president, with the exception of, as we saw in the past, with respect to President Yoon, insurrection or treason. And so now the big question really was, because there were ongoing trials, criminal trials against, in the past, against candidate Lee or Representative Lee of the National Assembly, who now, of course, is the president, whether or not those ongoing criminal investigations and criminal procedures and trials should go forward, because the Constitution itself is silent on the issue as to ongoing trials. Now, certainly no new criminal trials or prosecutions can go against the president while he's the president. But in this case, because we had pre-existing trials and prosecutions, whether or not those could necessarily be suspended while he's the president. So I think what the current approach, and I think this is the more conservative one actually, is that when someone is sitting as president, those criminal trials should be basically stayed. And what a stay basically means is a delay until the person, in this case the president, no longer is the president, and then theoretically, after the president leaves office and becomes a civilian again, then the criminal trials can proceed. So I think that's really the question, is because the Constitution is silent on the question about previous trials, whether or not this case, the president now can be immune from prosecution. I think it's pretty clear at this point that there's at least will be a stay in the proceedings, and then what remains to be seen is what happens after he leaves office. So for the time being, there's no real threat of the President Lee facing any criminal jeopardy when it comes to his current criminal trials.
All right, Professor Lee, I'm afraid that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much for your insight. We appreciate it.
It was a pleasure joining you.
South Korea saw the largest increase in employment in 13 months, rising for a 5th consecutive month in May. According to Statistics Korea on Wednesday, the number of employed people aged 15 or older in May reached 29.16 million, up 245,000 compared to the same period last year. Job additions in healthcare and welfare, as well as scientific and technical services, rose by 233,000 and 117,000 respectively. However, sluggish employment in the construction and manufacturing sectors remains, with 13 and 11 consecutive months of year-on-year decline, respectively. It's an exciting week for BTS fans as members Jimin and Jungkook were discharged from the military this Wednesday morning. The 2 members, who enlisted together on December 12, 2023, have completed their mandatory military service. BTS will soon be able to resume group activities with all the members, as RM and V were discharged just a day ago, and Jin and J-Hope completed their service last year. Suga, the last remaining member still serving in the military, is set to be discharged on June 21st. The South Korean national football team beat Kuwait 4-0 on Tuesday night to wrap up their World Cup qualifying campaign. Playing in front of a home crowd at the Seoul World Cup Stadium, second-half goals from Lee Gang-in, Oh Hyun-kyu, Lee-jae-sung completed the victory after an own goal from Kuwait in the first half. South Korea went undefeated to top Group B with 22 points from 6 wins and 4 draws. The Taeguk Warriors clinched their World Cup berth last Thursday with a 2-0 win against Iraq. Up next, a showcase here in Seoul suggests Botanical Gardens may be the key to sustainable solutions to some environmental concerns. Our Eizyongs files this report.
Environmental issues are a global challenge. But there's one solution that can boost biodiversity and cool the local environment: Botanical Gardens in arboretums. An event in Seoul is opening a new chapter in exploring their role in tackling environmental issues. The 11th International Congress on Education in Botanic Gardens.
From June 9th to 13th, the Coex Ground Ballroom has been transformed into a global hub of botanical garden education, where ideas take root and grow into solutions for a greener future.
The Global Forum on Botanical Garden Education comes to East Asia for the first time. This year's theme is Education for Change, Botanic Gardens' role in addressing global challenges. At the core of the conversations is the importance of working together as a community to mitigate environmental challenges. Keynote speaker Choi Jae-chun posed the idea that the COVID-19 pandemic was the result of imbalances in biodiversity.
If this severe imbalance in biodiversity isn't addressed in some way, we'll continue to face situations like this repeatedly. It's simply a matter of probability.
He highlighted the importance of botanical gardens as a means to promote biodiversity and raise interest in environmental conservation. Another keynote speaker, Shahbaz Khan, discussed the vital role of UNESCO in reversing climate change and highlighted botanical gardens as key tools in building sustainability.
The botanical gardens are important for keeping the cities cool, and they can be an answer to increasing temperatures. They can help us reduce the needs for the air conditioning, for example.
He pointed to thermal images of a city which showed how places with gardens had cooler temperatures and underscored the importance of botanical gardens in conserving plant species. Over the course of 5 days, participants are engaging in workshops, panel discussions, and a field trip to the Korea National Arboretum as they work toward a greener, more sustainable planet. Botanical artwork brings a colorful, creative layer to the educational experience, while booths showcase various contributions to environmental preservation. Pyongyang, Arirang News.
Now let's take a look at some stories from around the world with our Choi Ji-hee. Good morning, Ji.
Good morning, Enzi.
So in Europe, a mass shooting at a high school in Austria has left 11 dead. Fill us in on this.
Right, at least 11 people, including the suspect, have been killed in the shooting and many others were injured. The mass shooting happened shortly after 10 a.m. local time on Tuesday at a secondary school in the southern Austrian city of Graz. Police confirmed the suspect, a 21-year-old former student of the school, brought both a legally owned pistol and a shotgun into the school building. While no definitive motive has been confirmed, officials are looking into reports that he may have experienced bullying while attending the school. Austria has declared a 3-day mourning period and schools across Graz have been temporarily closed. Chancellor Christian Stocker condemned the violence, calling it a black day for Austria. The United Kingdom and 4 other countries announced sanctions against 2 Israeli cabinet ministers for inciting violence against Palestinians in the West Bank. The sanctions announced on Tuesday by the UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Norway include asset freezes and travel bans. They target Israel's National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir and Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich, both of whom are both prominent West Bank settlers. A joint statement by the 5 nations stated that the targeted ministers have incited extremist violence and serious abuses of Palestinian human rights, emphasizing that the measures are personal and don't affect official ministry functions. Israel's Foreign Minister Gideon Sa'ar condemned the sanctions as outrageous. And the United States warned the sanctions could hinder efforts toward a Gaza ceasefire and hostage negotiations. In Colombia, a coordinated series of bombings and shootings targeting police stations and roads in the southwest of the country left at least 7 people dead and dozens injured on Tuesday morning. More than 20 terrorist attacks were reported throughout the day, with assailants detonating bombs using cars and motorcycles while opening fire on police stations in the city of Cali and nearby towns. Police and military officials have blamed a guerrilla faction of the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia. President Gustavo Petro said Tuesday's attacks will be investigated for potential connections with a recent attack on a presidential candidate who remains in intensive care after being shot in the head.
While the southern regions had more intense heat yesterday, the Seoul metropolitan area saw some cloud cover that offered comfortable conditions. But with clear skies returning to the capital area, temperatures will be on the rise again. Meanwhile, Gyeongju, where it soared past 34 degrees yesterday, will see temperatures drop slightly to around 30 degrees this afternoon. But the sun will be very strong, with the UV index expected to be very high across much of Korea, except on Jeju Island with cloudy skies in the forecast at a high of 24 degrees Celsius. But most cities will see high of 29 degrees this afternoon. Meanwhile, a tropical depression formed yesterday over the waters west of the Philippines. It's forecasted to head towards southern China. This system could bring tropical moisture up to Korea, raising the possibility of heavy rain towards the end of the week. So let's keep an eye on that developing rain system. But for now, we are looking at nationwide rain on Saturday.
Now that's all we have for this morning. Arirang News will be back at 5 p.m. Korea time. Thanks for watching.